So, a criticism that I'm hearing more and more often these days is, well, you're just biased. Well, that's a pretty biased take. And that's something that I've heard for most of my life. People will, while offering commentary on a subject, they'll say, well, I, of course, am not an unbiased source. But it seems as though that complaint has become a lot more charged lately. And especially since so much of what went on in the past couple of political seasons was really explicit demagoguery, and maybe I should stop and define that term. Demagoguery is where you take the next step and you don't just say, my opponent is wrong, but you say, my opponent cannot be trusted. Therefore, I'm saying not just don't agree with my opponent. I'm not just saying agree with me and not my opponent. I'm saying listen only to me and shun my opponent. And whenever you see demagoguery at work, there's been a breakdown of trust. There's been a breakdown of the connective tissue and the shared consensus that we can all deliberate together, and even if we disagree, we all exist as one community. And I think the idea that the charge of bias becomes more and more severe and becomes more and more hostile, and more people are dismissive of anyone with a bias, I think people misunderstand what it means to say that someone is biased. And this is the kind of thing that we used to discuss in very, very basic college-level classes, the idea that everybody has a bias. But I think the idea of bias has become more frightening, more threatening, more of a serious charge than in the past. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about situations where you don't want things to be biased. You want the bias to be minimized. You want things, first of all, that measure. You want them to be unbiased measurements. There was a time in human history where down at the marketplace there would be scales to measure out what was being sold, and it was actually a fairly serious office held in the village to go and check the scales and make sure that they were fair. And it was a fairly serious offense if you were found to be putting your thumb on the scale, if you had a dishonest or corrupt scale. That was a form of theft, because you do want those measuring devices to give the same neutral, accurate, reliable measurements no matter what. One of my roles in my job is that I grade papers, and you really want for the grading to be consistent from person to person. You want for that to be unbiased. I had one professor when I was in college who took it so seriously that in one class, experimentally, when we turned our papers in, he had us leave our names off them, and he gave us ID numbers to use, and he set the system up to where he didn't know which ID number corresponded to which student, and he graded all the papers blind. And the university I teach at, the online learning platform is Moodle, and it has a setting in it for blind grading where students could turn in their papers, and if I have that setting on, I would grade the papers not knowing who had submitted them. Now, there are some logistical problems if you do that, and so I don't use blind grading very often. But the idea that that's an option, that's trying to minimize bias, and you use anonymity to do it. And that's an interesting thought that just occurred to me in the middle of this discussion. The way that you achieve minimal bias is not to know other people, and to know other people is necessarily to bring bias into it, because your entire history with a person is the source of bias. And maybe there is an intertwining of these phenomena that we know other people, or we think we know other people, and the history that we have with people in the current generation, because of the different direction that interpersonal skills have taken, that's become something that's very freighted with danger. And so maybe if you can deal with more and more people in your environment in a way where you're blind to them, where there's more and more anonymity, then maybe a byproduct of that is reduced bias, or at the very least an expectation, a demand for minimized bias. I don't know, I got to think about that one. It's also the case beyond measurements and beyond teaching that if you're going to be on trial, that you want your judge or your jury to be unbiased. And then where I think I wind up at the end of thinking through that is that where measurement is involved, or where fairness is involved, that is where you want You want to try to minimize bias, and bias is genuinely a bad thing, and I think there's a pretty easily reached consensus that with measurement or where fairness has been invoked, that bias is a bad thing. But the thing about fairness sits alongside other goals just about always, and something that I've noticed is it sits alongside but is not consistent with and often does not converge with the goal of reaching the truth or the goal of reaching the objective for which the institution exists. And that's kind of goopy in academics, so let me try to translate that into plainer English. I came into higher education through the world of intercollegiate competitive debate. And one of the things about that particular kind of competition is you get to argue over what the rules should be. And the two positions that are always in conflict whenever those debates happen is one side will say, well, if we argue it this way, we get to explore whatever the topic is, and we get to arrive at the best answer. We get to examine all the evidence, and where we wind up after all of our arguments, after we see where the chips fall, we wind up knowing the most about the topic. And the argument always posed against that is, yes, but fairness is an issue, and one side is being given a harder argumentative burden than the other, and those burdens should be roughly equal because this is a contest, and it's furthermore an educational contest, and so both sides should enter into the contest with an equal opportunity to win. Both sides should have equal work that they have to do to reach the objective against which they will be judged. So, what you have the two sides posed against each other, how do we reach the truth? How do we maintain fairness? Same thing happens in a courtroom, by the way, because what the court wants to do on one level, let's imagine that it's a criminal trial, even though there are other things that courts do, but let's imagine it's a criminal trial. One objective is you want to, if a crime was committed, you want to identify the guilty party. You want to fully air out what were the circumstances surrounding the crime so that the verdict is the appropriate verdict and that the punishment is rationally matched against the level of the offense. So was it first-degree murder? Was it second-degree murder? Was it self-defense, justifiable homicide? Figure out what it was, figure out who actually committed it, and then figure out what the appropriate response is. And all of that is about the quality of your evidence collection and your deliberation. But another goal that doesn't necessarily converge with that goal is you want to be fair. You want to be fair to the defendant. And behind that is the principle that it's better for 20 guilty people to go free than for one innocent person to be convicted. So a lot of safeguards are built in, and a lot of kinds of evidence are excluded, and lots of kinds of arguments may not be made, even though that evidence gets you closer to the truth, and even though those arguments would be a helpful part of deliberation. You rule all of that out of order because of the importance of fairness. It's also the case that in just about every athletic competition that humanity has ever dreamed up, that when you make changes, tweaks to the rules, you have, once again, those two positions balanced against one another. On the one side, you want to encourage people to excel. So you want the rules set up so that the people who really shine in that particular kind of athletic competition can play their very best. But at the same time, you want to keep everybody safe, and you want to bring all the competitors into the competition with a fair and reasonably equal chance to win the competition, and the rules will be written that way as well. So, achieving the objective of excellence, but at the same time making it fair. And it's when you are trying to achieve fairness that you want to minimize bias. But that drive to achieve fairness happens at the cost of the truth. And so, this is something that I very definitely have noticed, that people who want to dismiss positions, messages, information, they want to dismiss it as biased. That is, in a completely different pattern, hostile to gathering in all the perspectives that might lead you to come closer and closer to the truth. This is something that I've talked about in previous episodes of this, that so many of the problems I see are about a kind of loyalty, but it's not a warm loyalty, it's not a joyful loyalty, it's almost a desperate loyalty. It's a loyalty driven by anxiety. by a feeling of not being safe, not secure, not knowing what's going on. So you find the other people who describe their own experience the way you describe your experience, and you cling to them. There's an idea that I talk about in a lot of the classes that I teach, and my verbal shorthand for it is there's a world out there and there's a world in here. And because this is a recording, you can't see, but when I teach it to my students, I point to my forehead, because there's the world out beyond your senses, the objective world that other people occupy, but then there's the world you have inside your own brain. There's the world that is made up of all the data that your senses deliver to your brain. And when I am initiating this, when I'm teaching it for the first time, the first question that I ask is, we look around at all the students in the room and I say, who's the tallest one in here? And usually we know at a glance. And I say, let's say that we had to come up with a rigorous answer. How would we do it? Well, we would go get some kind of measuring device. Get a yardstick, get a tape measure, measure everybody from the soles of their feet up to the crown of their head. Then take the measurements for everyone, put it into Excel, sort, go from largest to smallest, and that's the answer. That's the tallest person. And then, just as a hypothetical, I say, what if someone in the room were to disagree and say, I define tall differently. I define tall as bold and courageous. And then they point to the shortest person in the room and say, I think that's the tallest person. Well, you don't get to do that, because tall is a feature of the world out there. Tall is objective. But the thing is, what if I were to ask the question, who's the friendliest person in the room? We might all have a different answer. And if I ask the question, who's the tallest person in the room, and someone disagrees, that person is irrational. It's irrational to disagree on objective measurements about the world out there. But who is the most, I shouldn't have said friendliest, who is the most likable person in the room? Who is the most pleasant person in the room? For as many people in the room, if there are 20 people in the room, we might have 20 different answers, and there is nothing irrational about that. Now, a lot of people want immediately to go to the idea that that which is objective, that which is the world out there and measurable, is somehow more true, more important, in a lot of different ways better than what is the world in here. But I'm here to tell you that's just a load of nonsense. Many of the most important things in the world are part of the world in here. You ask a parent of a child, what was the sensation like of holding your child for the very first time? There is no yardstick for that sensation. You know, you can measure things like skin resistance and heart rate to figure out what was our level of metabolic arousal, but there's no objectively agreed upon standard that can measure that. But tell me it's not important. It definitely is important. Features of social institutions like justice. There is not an objective measurement. Justice is not a feature of the world out there. It's a feature of the world in here. Now, the terms we use for those two worlds, that which is part of the world out there, I've already used the word a couple of times, it's objective. And when I say that, a lot of times my students just assume that everything about the world in here is subjective, and I hate that word, because subjective, I reserve subjective and the word opinion for things like, do you like vanilla better than chocolate? Because people do tend to like one or the other better, but not for any particular reason. It's just kind of a whim. But that which is the world in here, the experience of holding your child for the first time, your recognition of what's just or unjust, that's interpretive. Interpretive. It's part of your own experience of the world in a way that's not necessarily measurable. And it's not the case that, well, it's different for everybody, although a lot of college freshmen want to say it might be right for one person and not right for another person because they haven't learned how to think rigorously. Interpretive phenomena, things about the world in here, the way they're validated is intersubjectively. You want to confirm that holding your newborn child is a powerful experience? Just talk to 10 or 11 parents. And you might encounter a few who had a bad case of postpartum depression, and when they first held their child, what they felt instead was overwhelmed. Intersubjective phenomena do not tend to be uniform. One of my examples of something that's intersubjectively validated is the idea that Shakespeare is a powerful author. Now, does that mean 100% of the human race will think that Shakespeare is their favorite author? No, far from from it. But can you deny that across generations and across the globe, an enormous segment of the human race has found Shakespeare really worthwhile to read, really challenging, well-crafted writing? No, you can't deny that. So even though that's not measurable, even though there's no yardstick, no tape measure for quality of literature, you can still say, as an interpretive feature of reality, Shakespeare's writing is powerful. So what we get from this idea, the idea that we encounter things differently, and the things that we encounter differently are part of they're some of the most important things that we encounter in life, some of the substance of meaning. I would say in just about all cases, all the objective measurements we have in the world started out as our direct experience. I mean, an inch, a foot, a yard, a mile, we defined all those things as we learned to communicate with one another by conveying to one another our own direct experience of the world. So the interpretive phenomena are prior to the objective phenomena. The interpretive phenomena, our inner reality, we only in limited circumstances can package it into something objective and then transmit it to somebody else. And most of the messages that we send are not objective. They're not part of the world out there. They are little islands surrounded by these enormous oceans of meanings that we kind of get. And if that is the nature of reality, if that is the nature of communication and of relationships and how we interact with one another, then what kind of problem is it when the word bias becomes such a dirty word? When the willingness to endure, the willingness to work through different perceptions seems so threatening when your neighbors, to the extent that they disagree with you on any of the issues being deliberated about publicly, that difference, that deviation from your own position makes them not potentially an enemy, but probably an enemy. When we come to that state of affairs, then we are in kind of bad shape. Now, the next idea that I had in my inventory of ideas this week was the idea that one facet of credibility, and I talk about credibility in a lot of classes, chiefly having to do with persuasion. Credibility, it's that construct is formulated a lot of different ways, but typically there are three facets that make up credibility. There's competence, there's dynamism, and then there's trustworthiness, and I put that one third for a reason. Competence, do you know what you're talking about? Do you have some level of expertise? When you say things, do they check out? Dynamism, do you seem as though you are fully engaged? Do you seem apathetic, or do you seem the opposite of apathetic? And I can say, it may be a tiny bit of a cheap shot, but the current occupant of the Oval Office seems to have almost infinite dynamism, and people to whom he appeals seem to forgive him any lapse in competence. He can say all kinds of things that don't check out, where if you try to track down the details and confirm them, you can't do so. That never seems to damage his credibility with his core of followers. And that is such a phenomenon that I just have not seen before, that it continues to just bewitch me. But then the third and final facet of credibility is trustworthiness. And trustworthiness largely is about, does this person share your values? Now, when community is healthy, when you're in a chapter of history where neighbors get along well and communities work in the way that I think they ought to work, in a way that I think most of us wish they would work, that match between values does not need to be precise. It does not need to be straight down the line, statement for statement. And given what I said earlier about how much of the interpretive experience of the world dominates, overshadows, eclipses the objective features of the world, I think it just about is never the case that people's values match perfectly. So a rough correspondence between values. I mean, even husbands and wives do not have 100% correspondence between what they think of as important or less important, what they think of as right or wrong. But the values need to roughly correspond. One of the things that I talk about whenever I teach conflict is there is greater opportunity to settle conflict in a constructive way when people's goals overlap, when people can say, we ultimately in the end want the same thing. If I'm bickering with one of my colleagues, but we realize that what both of us want ultimately is for students to leave this university educated and equipped to go out and succeed, if we can focus on where our goals overlap, that's the foundation for how we are going to handle the conflict in a constructive way. And if we who live together in a country, in a neighborhood, as members of a church, if we can identify our overlapping goals, then that's the foundation from which we can solve problems. Where I think we are is we have a harder and harder time. Well, and I almost said it wrong. I don't think we have a harder and harder time identifying overlapping goals, because I think we could do this all day. We have the goals that the nation be at peace. We have the goals that the economy do well, that everyone have an opportunity to find a job that pays well and satisfies them. All of us, I think, would say that we share those goals. But what I think we're doing is we're insisting that the overlap of the goals be more and more complete. And this is something that I've taken swipes at in previous episodes, but I think we do that because of our anxiety, because we think that we cannot be secure in a world that we've figured out, that the base ideas that we operate from as we go about our daily business, we have less and less reason to be confident in them. So we almost have to compensate for that by surrounding ourselves and interacting exclusively with people who have a very complete agreement with us, where there's only minor deviation happening. The world these days is very chaotic. It's very unpredictable. All sorts of things that we thought that we didn't have to worry about, we find out we do have to worry about, that those things are not a given. I wasn't planning on being autobiographical here, but I don't think I've mentioned this in a previous episode. When I was 13 years old, I came home from school on the last day of 8th grade, and that night my father died very suddenly of a heart attack, and the sensation I felt more than anything was shock, because I just didn't know that was a possibility, and I think that's the world that a lot of people live in these days. And I think it's almost as though we get habituated to it, because watch what comes up over and over again in the news. Watch how many stories are featured. Watch how many stories go viral, much as I hate that term too. How many stories people circulate around to one another. And they're the kinds of stories that people read them and say, what is wrong with people? Because someone behaves in a way where they violate a fundamental precept. It may be how they treat their children. It may be how they treat their animals. It may be a stupid crime that they committed that you would think they would have enough sense to realize was a really, really inadvisable idea. But it seems as though we feed on that there's a particular kind of anxiety that we've become habituated to, and now we have this view of the world that anything unwise, chaotic can happen at any moment, and we become so familiar with that we want to have that reaffirmed. It almost reminds me, this goes back a very long time, there was this argument and debate. It was a terrible argument, but there was an enterprising high school team. One year, the debate topic had to do with human rights, and there are a lot of governments around the world that commit grievous human rights violations, so they put together some arguments that pain is good. Pain is good. It's through pain that you grow. And one of the bits of evidence that we just laughed ourselves silly over was that just about everybody sitting in the dentist chair experiences a thin line between pain and pleasure. And right after, when you're a kid, right after you lose one of your baby teeth, your tongue keeps going back to that sore spot and pressing on it because, yes, it hurts, yes, it's sore, but it feels good. And now it seems to me as though maybe that feeling of anxiety that the world is unpredictable, that people go back and they press with their tongue on that socket where the baby tooth used to be. They go back and they read those stories that continue to outrage them and make them angry because at least that pain is familiar. Now, what does that offer as far as prospects for moving ahead? What does that offer as far as opportunities to make the community healthy? Again, I couldn't begin to say. One theme that I know that I have talked a lot about in previous episodes is that people's anxiety, this ambient high level of anxiety, that's a ready source of raw material. That's a big old fuel supply that some public figures can exploit. They can manufacture, using that as the raw material, they can manufacture wealth and power for themselves. And humans being who humans are, when they see that opportunity, they're going to take it. And it's just naive to assume anything else is going to happen. What I don't think they fully realize is that when they do take those raw materials and when they do exploit all that anxiety with their messages, with their business models, with the brands that they create, and the engagement they have day after day with their large audiences, where they whip up those sensations in order to harvest wealth and power and lots of followers and lots of popularity, they do to civilization what combusting fossil fuel did to the atmosphere. They poison it, because combusting fossil fuel always put particulate matter, always put nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, it always put toxic substances into the air that people then breathe. And it also, in a more insidious way, in a way that didn't produce an immediate danger, they heat it up. So the messages themselves are poisonous, but then the ambient level of heat slowly rising, and this has been rising almost throughout the history of the country. That raw material, as we burned it, the byproducts of it, we thought that we had plenty of time. We thought that it was just sort of an externality that, nothing that you find valuable in the world comes with absolutely no cost. Well, I think we underestimated the costs, and we are discovering in the more recent rounds of political office selection and political deliberation, we found that we have let these byproducts pile up to where they are now intruding and making it virtually impossible for our system to operate in a healthy way. And I'm getting down to the end of this, and really what I would say at the end of all this is there's no possibility for dialogue. There's no possibility for friendship. There's no possibility, really, for relationships of any kind if there is no engagement with people who are biased. The idea that people are biased is the same as the idea that people are fallible. It's the same as the idea that as people keep themselves alive, the metabolic processes that keep us from dying produce waste products. Opinions are like, a certain body part. Everyone has them, and they all stink. Opinions, biases are, a good working definition of bias is before you can hew to a particular set of principles, before you can land on an idea that reassures the person next to you that the two of you disagree in a way they can, or the two of you agree in a way they can cling to in a chaotic world, you first have to encounter the world. And the way you encounter the world will not be the same as the way the other person encounters the world. I don't care if you're identical twins. I don't care if you are both the two most zealous followers of a set of ideas. I don't care if you're the most passionate Christians, if you're the most right-wing Republicans, if you're the most radical communists, the two of you side by side, you'll still encounter the world differently. Each of you positioned against the other is going to be biased. And until we can find that concept, that reality of removal a little bit less frightening, until we can figure out what it is about our need for a certain amount of predictability, our need for a stable foundation to enter the world, we've got to figure out how to change the thinking, some of these thinking habits, to where demagoguery doesn't sound so attractive and disagreement doesn't sound so threatening. I really think if we got to where we had healthy communities where difference and disagreement didn't seem dangerous, and the whole melting pot thing wasn't something we repeated but had no real commitment to, if we could ever get back to that kind of healthy community and learning about one another over a period of time, over the course of a friendship, over the time from first meeting, if we could encounter these differences and consider them very profitable, very exciting, new discoveries, And if we could find our way back to the courage to not be threatened by them, then maybe that's the way to do it. And really what that makes me think is that next week's episode quite possibly should be about courage, because we are living in a chapter in our history where the thing it seems is the most rational is to find everything threatening and to react as harshly and as sternly as possible to that danger. So I think probably that's next week's episode, courage.